On behalf of the board, I do apologize for starting this study session late. It is a study session. The board cannot take action. We can give direction. We will have a presentation by Public Works. We'll ask the board if there's any questions, comments. We will ask the public for any questions or comments they may have. Any questions, we'll probably just write the questions down and deal with them at the end of the public comment period. And we will ask the board for some direction today, or at least maybe Mr. Tuffanelli might ask us for direction, not that we'll pay any attention to him.
Thanks, Marina.
Gary, did you want to make any opening comments? I'll give it to Mr. Garcia.
No, give it to Tom.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Garcia.
And I'm happy to pass this on to...
somewhere it's got to stop.
And then he'll pass it on to the consultant.
Okay, thank you.
Jonathan Mitchell, Public Works. Matt Boyer to my left. Brian Stevenson to his left. Dock and Engineering. They're going to perform the presentation today. We have revised exhibits updated from this staff report, so I'd like to go ahead and hand those to you as Matt starts.
Chair Callaway, members of the board, my name is Matt Boyer. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm the project manager for Dock and Engineering. We've been working with the county staff and the community over the last several months, and the purpose of today is just to update your board on where we've been, the decision point that we're at, answer any questions that you might have while you're in study session. We can talk a little bit also about the next steps. In the interest of time, I'll go through some of the background relatively quickly. This isn't a project that just came up in the last couple of weeks. We'll talk about the existing intersection very briefly and the history of the funding, some of the preliminary concepts that we've studied and why, summarize this coordination that we've done with the community and the stakeholders, talk to you about some of the design considerations that are what we use to develop our recommendations or our alternatives, talk a little bit more about, because parking is such a critical issue downtown, some of the additional areas for parking. A real brief comparison to some of the alternatives and where the critical issues differentiate between what we've looked at. Talk to you about the project budget, end with some next steps, and obviously, again, answer any questions that you might have. So,
I've got one question real quick. We were just passed this around. Is this any different than what was in our packet?
It's updated.
It's updated than what's in this? Okay, so it is different.
I believe those exhibits are updated, but the same as what was distributed at the community meeting last week. Okay. And our intent today was not to present formally any alternatives or information that wasn't discussed as part of the community meeting last week, although based on that input from the community, we've developed some additional ideas, and we'd be happy to talk with your board about that. So everybody's familiar with the existing intersection. I'll show you 3 photos very quickly. So this would be looking northeast. You've got the Good Friends restaurant directly diagonal across the intersection. This would be taken from the frontage of the historic rail depot. Tri-Dam Realty is off to the right-hand side of the picture. Big branch. We'll go to the next exhibit. This would be looking northwest. So now you're taking from the Tri-Dam Realty corner, or the historic rail depot would be just off to the left of that photograph, and you're looking roughly north. This is looking at the Tri-Dam Realty building. The historic rail depot is just off the photo to the right. The Marval Shopping Center is directly in the center of your view. So the history of this project, obviously it's one of the major intersections in Calaveras County. The first time, or the last time it was formally studied, was as part of Caltrans State Route 1226 bypass, and that work culminated in the year 2003. That was to develop at least a plan, a concept plan for an ultimate bypass of this intersection, similar to what Angels Camp, Sutter Creek, Sonora, and other Gold Rush communities have done over the years. But that's a very complex, costly, long-term improvement. So the project study report that Caltrans did identify improvements to the intersection as an interim solution to the existing congestion, and they identified both a traffic signalized alternative in concept and a roundabout alternative in concept. That led to the beginning of our work The county secured some federal funding last year from a program called Congestion Mitigation Air Quality. That's funding our work. Our work includes these preliminary concepts, the environmental studies, the final design, and the support during the bidding process. The project is identified in the county's road impact mitigation fee program, and it's been a long-standing priority for the county. Wanted to touch base a little bit on the details on the congestion mitigation air quality funding, because that's not only the funding source for our work, that's the most likely of the funding sources for the construction phase of the project. This is a funding source that's existed about 20 years. To understand how you can use and not use it, it's important to touch base on sort of the history of it. So, Clean Air Act of 1977 talked for the first time in comprehensive ways about how to attain federal air quality standards. By 1991, that Federal Clean Air Act had evolved to the point where it was pretty clear the proportion of air quality problems that have emanated from transportation, but there was no portion of transportation dollars to solve the transportation element of the air quality problem. Calaveras County still is out of attainment with the ozone standard, and so tailpipe emissions, oxides of nitrogen, and hydrocarbons are the two things that form in the atmosphere to create ozone. So a portion of the federal gas tax that we pay at the gas pump goes into this congestion mitigation air quality program for transit, bike, ped improvements, but also is eligible for certain types of road improvements, and that's generally intersection channelization where you create left turns or free right turn movements. You can use it for traffic signals. You can use it for roundabouts. We used it for Highway 50 carpool lanes. Because that supported the rideshare program, but it generally is not used for normal roadway improvements, because you've got to be able to demonstrate that with the use of those dollars, the total vehicle emissions is less than the current condition. So that is the initial grant from the COG with some additional money that was recently approved for construction, and that again is the most likely of the large dollars that the county's identified at this point. Formally, our work has looked at the roundabout and the signal alternative because that was implementing the interim improvements that Caltrans identified some years back. It wasn't to say that that was the full range of alternatives that was possible, but the immediate priority of the county was to improve the intersection and specifically the flow of traffic. During the course of interaction with the stakeholders in the communities, we have looked at a cursory level, some other what I consider vaguely I term options. They serve slightly different purposes, so they're probably not apples and oranges, or they would be apples and oranges versus apples and apples, but they do provide traffic flow benefits, and so those are things that we've looked at. That would include what I'd call a local road bypass or some local road connectors that might be related to either private development projects or as county projects to connect existing county roads. We looked at a very brief level, sort of the state highway bypass to put it in context in terms of cost and schedule. Anytime you do a project, always doing nothing is an option, both in terms of your environmental study and in terms of any policy that your board would set. And there are some other creative things that we've been looking at, even the end of last week and over the weekend. So over the coming weeks, based on your direction, we may or may not pursue some of those. In very brief, I wanted to orient the board on the two alternatives that have been described in general to the community in the meetings in March and then most recently last week. The real challenge for our company, the county staff, and your board is, at the end of the day, we are working on Caltrans State Highway. And in order for your constituents and your board to control sort of the policy of what happens, we've wanted to spend some time fleshing out concepts that we think Caltrans would approve based on their design standards and based on our experience with the district out of Stockton. But at the end of the day, until we get some direction from your board and flesh out an alternative or two and go meet with them, there's always the potential that considerations from Caltrans will modify these that would be different from a county road where your county staff and you would make the ultimate determination on what those improvements are. So with that as the caveat, the signalized intersection would be relatively large, and the biggest thing that contributes to the physical size of it is the left turn pockets need to be sized to accommodate between 10 and 20 years worth of traffic growth. And so currently, and it's a little bit From a non-engineering standpoint, it's a little counterintuitive to say we've got an existing intersection that basically doesn't have separate left turn pockets, through lanes, and right turn pockets, but the minute that you start adding those, you've got to have sufficient storage for the movements. But there are some safety and operational reasons why that's the case. So if you were to consider this exhibit to be north is up, which isn't totally true, but it makes the conversation easier, headed northbound from the bottom of the exhibit past the Marvell Shopping Center on the right, headed up to the 1226 intersection, and then which then continues on as Laurel Street. That left turn pocket extends back to approximately, to beyond the last entrance to the Marvell Shopping Center, and certainly conflicts with the driveway entrances to the 76 gas station. And you have the same dynamic that happens from west to east, coming into town, headed towards San Andreas, along the historic rail depot, the Napa Auto Valley Inn properties. And then the odd configured intersection at Chestnut, California Street, and the highway on the roughly the east side of the intersection also would likely, because of the left turn pockets, have some modifications in access. By virtue of having long left turn lanes, the street's relatively wide. You've got a road that's double, in some cases, essentially the existing width of the roadway. In order to not impact properties on the north side of the intersection, we have shifted all of the improvements down towards the south, but that does have some impacts on the existing on-street parking. So we want to make you and the community aware of that. In order to accomplish a design like this, we would probably lose approximately 11 of the on-street parking spaces. But you do have a project that would work at least for the next 10 to 20 years in terms of traffic operations. So that's a brief overview of what that alternative would look like. In contrast, let's go to the roundabout alternative. And I should say there is no county staff or consultant preference to the signal versus the roundabout based on the order we presented it. We actually flipped a coin this morning to figure out which was a better way to go, because there is a community discussion about which is preferred. The roundabout is an even greater challenge for us to design. Supervisor?
Just one quick, going back to the other slide.
Yes.
Have we identified what current Highway 12 improvements are? It's my understanding they're going to go up to Cedar Street under the current project.
Somewhere between Pine and Cedar, we have a request in from Caltrans to provide those.
Trying to identify, yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
Specific limits. I believe, and this is a little bit of a guess, so take it for what it's worth, that where the repaving project ended recently, and you can notice a difference in the asphalt, I believe that's the limit line, and that Caltrans' intent was basically to build up to it, and that's why the overlay didn't extend further to the west. But it's somewhere between Pine Street and Cedar Street.
Well, the reason I bring it up, looking at this, you have a culvert widening there, and they're currently, right now, doing that in that construction zone. And I'm not sure if that one is not scheduled to be.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
No, that's something that came up at the community meeting last week. We were not aware of that widening project 5 months ago when we had the first round of community meetings, and we should have updated that exhibit. And I'll make a note to make sure that in the future we know exactly what those limits are, and will that culvert be widened as part of the Caltrans work that's under construction right now. The roundabout alternative is a little bit more of a challenge for us to design, because normally when you're working on state highway improvements, you have Caltrans design standards, you design things to their standards, where for one reason or another you might deviate from those standards, you request an exception to those standards. Caltrans actually does not have a standard for roundabouts. They defer to guidance that comes from the Federal Highway Administration. What that means is when you go present a proposed design to them that includes a roundabout, rather than saying, here's your standard and here's the 3 or 4 places we've deviated from that standard, you bring in all the different Caltrans functions and into essentially a true engineering dialogue. And it's a little bit more interactive and a little bit more educated guesswork based on some of the other roundabouts that we've done in District 10 as to whether this is the design that they would prefer and approve. But based on work that we've done as recent as last month in the city of Plymouth, we think that this represents the way that that alternative would be. And so in each of the movements towards the intersection, a key feature of the roundabouts is making sure that the angle of entry to the circulating lane comes in at exactly the right angle so that you can look over your shoulder, you can see the traffic in the circulating lane, but you're also not angled at an angle that would contribute to accident rates. And so one of the reasons that there are typically less accidents in roundabouts is by virtue of that precise angle of entry. You also see those green islands between the in and outs to each of the legs of the intersection. Those help direct traffic properly through it. It also provides sort of a refuge area for pedestrians as they walk across, because with roundabouts, in theory, you've got a continuous flow of traffic. You want to have something that's safe, so you've got crosswalks on either side of what we would call splitter islands. The big issues with respect to this concept are slightly shorter approaches to the intersection, so there's slightly fewer impacts to existing driveways and cross streets in terms of the ability to go left in and out. There is slightly greater impact to on-street parking in order to accommodate the roundabout, particularly on the north half of the intersection. Cost-wise, we'll see in a minute, it's probably slightly less expensive to construct the roundabout, although the engineering, the environmental studies, and the right-of-way acquisition costs are roughly a wash. Brian, if we want to go to the next slide. After the first two community meetings in March, we were asked to take a look at what we consider this benefit would come from some of the connectors, because it's not really part of our scope and it's not necessarily eligible for the congestion mitigation air quality dollars. We put an exhibit together to show all of the different connectors and alignments that have been identified over the last 20 years. And we've talked to the community in general about those. And Brian, maybe as we go to the next slide, the coordination that we've done with the stakeholders has been focused in those three community meetings, 2 in March, 1 last week. We've done our best. The county staff has done an incredible job of reaching out to make sure people knew about the meetings. Probably the most extensive job I've ever done in my career, and I've tended to emphasize public participation. So we've done the newspaper ads and inserts. We did the robocalls to people within a certain geographic range. We did the roadside banners and made a number of other attempts so that everyone had an opportunity to come to the meeting and understand what this information was. Most of these design considerations are pretty routine. These are things that we would bring to every project, but we always look at minimization of impacts to private property. So that's physically acquiring the least amount of land necessary, minimizing any impacts to private parking, minimizing any impacts to on-street parking, minimizing any impacts to access. Obviously, the purpose of the project is to improve traffic flow, so we want to do that to the best we can. We want to worry about pedestrian traffic safety at the same time, minimize costs, both the construction cost and the ongoing cost to maintain and operate the improvements. So, like all projects, there is never an alternative that best fits all of those criteria. It's always a trade-off between cost or one of the other factors there. One of the things that we have found based on our work, and we share the same traffic consultant that's working with the county on the general plan update, is we don't think, and Brian, maybe we could go back for just 1 second to one of the alternatives. The nature of the traffic going through that intersection is relatively complex for a small community. You've got traffic that's related to the immediate area, the Mar-Vell Shopping Center and some of the other businesses and some of the other residences, the elementary school. You've got people that are commuting through the intersection to point to jobs that are to the west and living to the east. And so we've found that improving the intersection alone probably will not solve your ultimate problems for traffic at this location. But simply looking at local road connectors or bypasses also probably doesn't solve the problem. And the big unknown is the bigger picture economy, the local economy, all of which are going to affect how much travel do you have sort of within the donut, if you will, and through the donut or in the outside. But to the best of our ability, Brian, maybe if we go back into the design considerations, The ultimate solution for the county, if we're projecting 15 or 20 years ahead of time, is probably some level of improvement to the intersection and some other combination of road improvements to help alleviate certain movements of traffic through the intersection. So no magic bullet. A couple of last quick slides. Because we know that impacts to parking is a critical issue, there are 3 locations that we think are most likely to be places that we could replace most or all of the lost on-street parking. There is the possibility of using the former grocery store parking lot there on the roughly northwest corner of Cedar Street and Highway 12. There's a little remnant of land that's right there at the California Street, Chestnut Street highway intersection that we might be able to do something creative with. It creates 2 traffic operational problems to have that sort of uncontrolled area there. Land acquisition under any improvement alternative probably involves the parking or building a tri-dam realty, so there would be some potential to use the remainder of that to create some parking in what would be roughly the southeast corner. I think we did a pretty good job of hitting the highlights on comparing the alternatives. There's a slight loss of parking on street with either the signal or the roundabout, but more loss of parking in the roundabout. Access is about the same, but slightly less impacts to access with the traffic signal versus the roundabout. That's because the traffic signal turn lanes extend so far back. The roundabout requires slightly more land to be acquired, but we're talking about a couple of thousand square feet. In our world, where we've got projects that you acquire 5 or 6 acres of land, the difference between 8,000 or 9,000 square feet between one alternate and the other is roughly a wash, even though any acquisition of land is important. Preliminary budget, I would ask that you really take this with a grain of salt because there's so much dialogue that has yet to occur with Caltrans. But we do think that the construction of the signal is probably slightly more because of the signal hardware and the extent of the turn lanes going back from the intersection. So at the high end, we think in a normal construction economy that might total about $4 million worth of project costs. Compare that to a little over $2.5 million for the roundabout project. In this construction economy, either one of those is probably significantly less. And the last thing I would leave you with would be, kind of where we are in the process. We're very early on in our work. A little bit of a chicken and egg scenario. We really want a community-driven design, which necessitates that we spent the time with the stakeholders that we have and then get direction from you today. We're hoping to get down to a single alternative and be able to present that to the Caltrans district as the county's preferred alternative and the county's willingness to use local dollars to invest in improving the state highway system. Caltrans no longer controls money to fix its own problems. And so it necessitates, but it creates an interesting dialogue with them when you want to use your money to improve their roadway, but they can be sometimes more or less flexible in how much they want you to design something to their perfect world standard. Based on the timing of any meetings with Caltrans and any further need for board direction, the best case scenario is we'd be able to finalize alternatives by this time, finalize alternatives this month, begin construction about 1 year from today after the environmental studies, and be open to traffic sometime in early 2012. So with that, I would be more than happy to answer any questions or see if Tom, you or Jonathan had anything to add.
Tom, Gary, did you want to start?
Yeah, I've got one start. First off, you mentioned that you were involved in other roundabouts in District 10. One question is where are they located? You mentioned Plymouth, and are they on highway intersections similar to this one? In other words, can people go out if you give them where they're at to look at them and see how they operate?
District 10 of Caltrans, which is essentially San Joaquin, Stanislaus, and Merced counties in the Central Valley, and Alpine, Amador, Calaveras, Tuolumne, and the mountain counties, has never approved a roundabout within their boundaries. We have worked on designs with them in several intersections, Plymouth most recently, State Route 99 at the Pallandale interchange in Modesto.
So there is none that have been
There are
constructed?
none in this district of Caltrans, that's correct.
What about the one at Truckee?
There are a couple of roundabouts on the state highway off-ramps on State Route US 80.
Right.
Correct. And there are a few more that have opened in California in the last couple of years, and the original one, I think, was down on 101 in Santa Barbara.
So as far as District 10 is concerned, if this comes to fruition, then it would be the first roundabout in District 10.
Plymouth
Constructed
might come first.
Plymouth might get constructed first.
We still believe Plymouth as a concept will be approved in the next month or two.
Oh, it hasn't.
And then it's up to the community to select ultimately its alternative, and then for construction. That's correct.
Which is slightly different than what we're doing here.
Correct.
We're trying to have the community and the board select the alternative that we go to Caltrans and shorten the review process.
Well, I would like to go back to both of the roundabout and the signal alternatives. I've got some problems with both of them with the amount of right-in and right-outs. When I initially met with Tom and Jonathan after seeing these, it forces all of this traffic onto surface streets. Even if you look in front of the ice cream parlor where it's right in and right out, those people are going to go right in, they're going to go right out, over to the left-hand turn lane, down Laurel Street, around to Cedar Street, and out right, and going back out west. All of those, even the right in, right out to the gas station, Tridam Realty, there's no alternatives for them to get back any other way than going to the surface streets, coming back around, going back, making a left-hand turn, and going down south on Highway 26. It just forces a lot of traffic on those surface streets. This particular one does a lot more than the roundabout one, but the roundabout one takes up a lot of area for parking. It just takes a tremendous amount. And Good Friends doesn't have an excess parking the way it is right now. On a good night there, Friday night or Saturday night, they're overflowing on the surface streets basically for parking there. As I'm looking at these, where Napa is, you've got right in and right out there. Well, there's an alley that you can go out back, so it forces it onto surface streets. I'm not in favor of putting a lot of traffic onto these back surface streets. That's the first thing that struck me when I had initial conversations with them. The signalization, I think, at the public meetings was the one that most people felt more comfortable with the signal there than a roundabout. Although it takes up, if you're looking at Highway 12 from Cedar Street to the intersection, it looks on paper like a freeway to me. And we would lose just the whole character of that downtown. You're going all the way over pavement, all the way over to the ice cream depot and the train station there, basically, wiping out all that frontage. And you maintain some parallel parking in front of the Napa and the Little League and Flyers market there. That is because you have to maintain a straight through, a left-hand turn pocket, and a right-hand turn pocket. But I question the length of that left-hand turn pocket, the need of being that long. I'm not guessing that there's a lot of traffic that's going to back up going there. The right-hand turn one, maybe. So I think the possibility, if this is the number one alternative, that we could do some work to reduce possibly the length of this freeway that I'm looking at going through the downtown. I also had brought up when I talked to Tom and Jonathan on the gas station, the 76 gas station, that's being forced to go right in and right out. Right now, many people use it for left-hand. They turn left and go out. He's basically going to be losing a lot of his business with this design, either one of these two designs, basically, as I look at it. I was talking to them about approaching that property owner and Marvell and taking out the wall, the existing wall between the properties right now, and making it more of a plaza and seeing if they're agreeable to doing that. So it would, I think, even create more business for all businesses in there. People stopping to get gas would no longer have to go back out, or back around. It's all one plaza type shopping center. So I would like to see if we can explore that route. There was one other alternative that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and I approached Tom and Jonathan about it last week. And yesterday morning, I think we spoke, and that was an alternative that apparently you guys had given some thought to also, and that was a free right-hand turn. Instead of doing all these improvements all around, is a free right-hand turn heading north on 26 onto East 12. And there's also, at the time being right now, a right-hand turn on that only intersection. There is a right-hand turn heading east on 12 coming up to 26, improving that somewhat. And then a left-hand turn pocket coming east on 12 to that intersection, going south on 26. I think you would maintain the rural atmosphere of that. You're not destroying a whole lot of properties. You're not alleviating anything on the north side by realigning the existing Highway 12 on the east. You would probably be taking out that tri-dam building to do the realignment to increase for the left-hand turn pocket and the free right-hand turn. But to me, it leaves more of a rural type setting that you have in this town. It's not turning it into a freeway or European roundabout or so. I actually prefer this design myself. You still have the right in, right out there at the gas station. I'm not sure what else we can do for that, but if we can tear down that wall and give access from the parking lot, I think it's a viable option, in my opinion.
Maybe just as a quick comment, I think you and I met several months ago, just before the first couple of community meetings. In a prior life, I essentially was Director of Transportation in El Dorado County and very sensitive to those property owners and parking concerns, so that's not unusual. And I think everything that you identified in terms of the downside of the roundabout and the signalizing intersection were things that have been high on my radar screen. By the second community meeting, we minimized those designs to what we thought was the minimum that we could, within the box thinking, get through Caltrans District 10. But after the community meeting last week and sitting down and thinking further about what we might do, we actually did come up with this alternative completely independent of
anything that we have.
And so it does exactly as you said. It would include the free right movements on the south half of the intersection, and it would also include what we're suggesting would be reciprocal access between the Marvell Shopping Center, the 76 station, and the remnant or remainder of the parcels around the Trident Realty building. That all of that might be more accessible, blended better as a sense of community, and maybe even have enhanced property values if we could figure out if we could eliminate as many of the points of access, make it into a common modern shopping center with great visibility for all of the businesses. Going back to the intersection, essentially what this would do is it would build the southern half of a hybrid between the signal and the roundabout. So go from the center line of the roadway and one of the two alternatives and build the southern half of it. We had our traffic consultant over the weekend do some real rough calculations. We think that this does potentially get you 10 years of benefit even as an always stop intersection, and you certainly could modify it at some point to signalize it as well. But it would work to some degree as a stop-controlled intersection. I don't want to pretend that we've done as much analysis on this as we have, and it's all preliminary, but I think that this does address some of the concerns that have been high on your radar screen.
It's very interesting that we kind of came up with, when I sat down with them yesterday, I went through the whole thing with them, and then they said, well, our consultant has come up with something also independently, so I think you wouldn't get any complaints from the gas station owner for the access. You tearing down the wall and making that all a modern-type shopping center. I think, given that he only has a right in and right out right now, or after the work is done here at this intersection. Of course, you'd have to broker some deal with the owner of the shopping center itself. But I'm sure they would be open to increase business for them also, because it now opens it up for anybody to freely move if they're going to get gas or for shopping or whatever, without going back out on the highway to get to that business. So.
Matt, maybe you can bring up any improvements you do to the relatively westbound lane for this intersection. There's a reasonable queue time. Well, go through left. In the signalized version, there's a rather long left turn pocket, and I don't see that as part of this, where you'd be separating the turn versus straight.
In this alternative, we would still, because of the westbound to the left-hand turn onto 26 is a major movement out there. Anybody driven in the afternoon, it's an afternoon backup that tends to go back up to the Marvell driveway. In this minimal layout, we would be installing and striping in that left turn pocket. With that, it brings in access issues similar to the signalized intersection for that Chestnut, California intersection. Highway Patrol doesn't like people going all the way across the left turn pocket to go the opposite direction. So that becomes all sort of a right in, right out there. And that turn pocket for the movement stretches out almost to the fire station for the queue length that the traffic forecast is projecting. And we can do a better job of showing that.
Well, on this signalized map, it extends that far also.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. It's that westbound, in this minimal alternative, it's the same striping layout on the signalized for that 1226 leg of the intersection.
That one area that you're talking about there in front of the Cockeyed Cafe, that little triangular area right now that's kind of like an on-ramp, it acts as from California Street going across, what is it, Chestnut. There's quite it ranges from right there at Chestnut Flat to quite a bit of elevation as it goes west. There's probably maybe an 18-inch difference in elevation from the top of the roadway down to those businesses. So there would be some challenge there. Earlier you were talking about making some parking area there, which I'm not opposed to, but there would be some challenges there as far as trying the elevation changes there. Even in front of Good Friends, there's about a 12-inch curve as you get up right to the stop sign area itself.
So there were a couple reasons why we didn't really include this in our presentation today and just kept it as an extra slide until we had a chance to talk with the county staff this morning. One was that it wasn't something we had an opportunity to present to the community last week, and we wanted to make sure that we kept our presentation as consistent as possible. The other was there are some details of this that require a little bit more interaction with the traffic consultant, and so exactly how we would size that left turn pocket, how we would deal with that Chestnut intersection, and whether or not we could accommodate some parking in there. I have a feeling there's some other creative tweaks to this now that we've got this far, if the board wanted us to go in that direction. So I would consider this to be real preliminary and would like to get as much board feedback as possible.
Matt, can we talk about the information that's down in that little bubble at the bottom?
Yes.
Tell us the significance of that.
Sure. So after a series of brainstorms that we had in our office Wednesday night, Thursday night, into Friday, I asked our traffic consultant and Brian to look at a couple of different things design-wise and traffic-wise. Based on the work that had been done for the general plan, different alternatives, the traffic sub-consultant looked at current traffic. Year 2014 represents what Caltrans might call opening year plus a little bit. So that's an important year for them. I believe the county's level of service standard is C, and I'm looking to Tom and Jonathan for confirmation. So it used to be very common for local jurisdictions to have a level of service C definition. That's always a little bit hard to equate into real world. Level of service E is the most congested situation you would get without having a gridlock, and it's generally still accepted in more urban areas. Rural areas tend to not get to that point, but we believe the volumes in the year 2024 or 10 years beyond an opening day plus would at least achieve a level of service E, which from the state highway standpoint is probably acceptable. From a county general plan policy standpoint, may or may not be acceptable to you.
Perhaps you can equate that to the level of service we currently experience.
Your level of service in the peak periods is level of service F, and lacking channelization, you don't have any movements that aren't subject to that level of service F condition. So maybe a simpler way to answer Mr. Garcia's question originally would have been, we think this alternative gives you a better traffic situation 10 to 15 years from today than what you have currently today, obviously with as minimal an impact on parking and local access as possible. Again, the big wild cards are, it's not a static world, and so development decisions or changes in travel behavior due to the economy, people may be vacationing more locally and not less. Changes in the local economy, changes in other local road connectors, all of that has the potential to influence what your levels of service would be. But if the world was a static environment and we used the worst case or most intense general plan alternative, you would see better traffic 14 to 15 years out in that intersection you see today.
In your opinion, is this something that you think Caltrans would approve?
In my professional opinion, I think yes. And in a strange way, intuitively, I think it might be easier for them to accept a less than 20-year. Normally, Caltrans has a perspective. They want to see 20 years of traffic improvement to meet their level of service standard after the year you open it. So in this case, they would want to see an improvement that works in 2032, 2034. And that's why we started with such large improvements for the signal and the roundabout. We kept nudging them down to try to minimize the impacts. We've known that when we go and open that dialogue with Caltrans, that's going to be the toughest road to hoe is well, if we're investing to make things better, why do we need to meet a 20-year design standard? I think because we're not touching all the legs of the intersection, that conversation actually is easier, not harder. Because this looks more like the kinds of improvement that they would normally negotiate with a private developer that maybe is improving one or two legs of an intersection that were impacted. And that's just purely a guess. I think the conversation will still be difficult because they'll still start with well, in 20 years out, what are we going to do?
Can we talk with having said that 20 years out, what are we going to do? Can we look at this last presentation here? At the onset, I would like to submit to you and everybody here that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 options with multicolors kind of overlapping pathways that I think that it's really very foolish to even consider that because of the sensitivity of the environment in that low portion of the creek. Whereas that other one, it shows up as a kind of a hot pink on our thing here. On there, it's more of a purple. The one that we tromped out on, Matt, there. From my perspective, I think that is certainly our ace in the hole to be able to explain to Caltrans that we do have this would be the direction we would go as soon as the modifications, and I love the modifications that you and Gary have come up with on that intersection. It's brilliantly done. I think it minimalizes the cost, first of all, and the disruption is also minimized. But wouldn't you agree that based on the field trip that we took the other day, that this pathway, you might talk to the board members about what we saw out there?
So just to kind of recap, these alignments here basically flow into the companion piece of it to create the full bypasses that were really part of the Caltrans study from years ago. And yes, those are complex, long-term, very expensive improvements that may or may not be necessary. We did look a couple of weeks ago at if you only built one of those, what we might call quadrants, 1/4 of the bypass of the intersection, it turned out that in and of itself, neither this half of a full bypass nor this half of a full bypass really alleviated the need to improve the intersection. So that's an important piece of the puzzle in determining that there's probably a casserole of improvements that ultimately needs to happen to accommodate the different kinds of traffic currently going through the intersection. Once you reach that conclusion, then the question is, could you do a series of local road connections like this, most of which I think used to be in many, many decades ago, some form of a public or semi-public road, and another connector in the other quadrant, and achieve some diversion of traffic along both of those such that you would alleviate enough to minimize the need to improve the intersection. I think the likelihood is you probably would still need a casserole of improvements, and one of the things we looked at after our field meeting was, well, what happens to this intersection at Hogan Dam and that new road, and would we need to signalize that intersection? That's a real kind of sliding door situation. I think if you asked our traffic people to assess it, starting with human behavior, the answer might be that the volumes are significant enough to need to signalize it. But if you start bringing in a series of improvements and provide multiple and redundant routes for people to move, I think those connector routes make a lot of sense in the bigger picture. I would suggest that there's probably a separate study effort that may be more micro than the general plan, but more macro or bigger picture than this effort to really get at what those...
It just for the benefit of the people in the room that may not know, that what the alternative route that he's talking about goes from New Hogan Dam Road to Lime Creek Road.
So there's Lime Creek.
That's Lime Creek. They're continuing.
And then New Hope. Thank you for that.
Russ, do you have any?
Well, I was just wondering, this presentation here showed some alternative timelines.
Yeah.
That last slide that you showed about the intersection, I mean, seems like to me that intuitively, if it's half the work, it would also equate to possibly half the time. I mean, a lot of it, of course, is lead-up time and permitting and securing the entitlements. But I mean, that seems like a no-brainer to me that proceed with that minimalized approach. So.
Yeah, the big question on any improvement with the intersection probably is the right-of-way acquisition. The improvements to the intersection are not anticipated to have significant environmental issues for study. It's a disturbed area, so you're not likely to encounter archaeological resources or endangered species or things like that. We know that there's the potential for some contamination that may or may not have been remediated over the years. That's not really considered an environmental impact. That's considered something that you just deal with in the course of the project. So the land acquisition is likely to be one of the larger lead times. The federal portion of the environmental documents, because we're using federal funding, does get processed through Caltrans, and some of those are more or less expedient. But we definitely think that this would be the fastest possible state and federally environmentally cleared project.
If I can come up here and point out something, I guess one of the important parts of it is this building here may have to go. But one of the important parts of it is the building may have to go. Because I just learned from Supervisor Pavanelli, the same person that owns this parcel also owns this parcel. So if they were to get compensated enough, they could move their existing building, not the existing building, but relocate over here, have a lovely plaza in front of them. That seems like a win-win situation for everyone. And at what point, you mentioned the other night that you're sort of precluded by existing protocols to not engage in conversations with the landowners too early, but it seems like to me that you should go there this afternoon and start talking to them.
There's a couple different issues. I think in terms of talking general impacts to properties, talking about creative solutions like, would they be interested in reciprocal accesses and things of that nature, I think that's certainly fine. When you get into valuations of property and acquisition values and stuff, that's really for another day.
I know. But,
Is there any other question?
okay.
Steve, Tom? I'd like to open it up to the public if there's any public comments or questions.
Come on, Ed. Stay out of there.
And I'll try to be brief. Better than wait for 3 hours. Good afternoon. My name is Ed Anderson from Burson, and I have some major concerns about a consideration of a roundabout regarding public safety. Has any of these discussions taken place at any previous meetings on public safety? Can you turn your map to the roundabout or the runaround, whatever you want to call it? The area in green in the heart of it, what is that? No man's land?
Typically, that is an area that would have a landscape or other feature that would help direct people's attention around the roundabout and keep them from seeing through the intersection, amongst other reasons.
So then it's a significant size and area that'll be utilizing surface area that could be used to get vehicles through the intersection. My point here is that roundabout is wasted space and at a considerable cost. One of my main concern with the roundabout is the additional time and the havoc it's going to cause for fire engines to navigate. I can't hardly believe that this hasn't been considered, the impacts as for public safety, and they may have been. If they have been, tell me.
I've heard them, yes.
Pardon?
I've heard people discuss that, those same concerns.
Yeah. If there were an emergency, see, that's a vital intersection for emergency services and calls, because we don't have too many intersections like this one. There's one at Burson Road. Please don't even consider putting one of these down on Burson Road. Wipe out our town. But if it's loaded with the public in a peak hour, and all of a sudden we have an emergency, can the people move away and allow access for the emergency vehicles?
And I'm not sure, I don't want to necessarily get into dialogue or interrupt the gentleman's comment. Roundabout designs evolved significantly over the last 15 years, and the safety considerations have been, I think, fully considered, and we get too much in the discussion of safety. It looks like we're trying to be supportive of a roundabout versus a signal, which isn't our intent. One of the benefits of the roundabout is by continually flushing all the traffic through, you have less opportunity for vehicles to queue into the emergency vehicles' ways. So I don't believe you'd find any technical evidence, and probably a growing body of evidence that on the whole, you have significantly more safety with respect to roundabouts.
Yeah, okay, we can agree or disagree, and I personally disagree. In an emergency, there's a different situation that occurs. It's not like you're going to lose 5 minutes to work or something. You have to get there, and as soon as you can. And I can see having to travel at a greater distance to get through the intersection by having a roundabout. You have to circle around the circle to get through the damn intersection. That's number one. Number two, if there's an emergency happening at peak hour, the traffic's not going to be flowing fast. It's going to be extremely slow. And how are you going to get through your emergency vehicles in a fast or reasonable manner? Time is very critical. To take an intersection like this and to stall public safety vehicles, that's not my concern. It's not the safety part of getting the vehicle through it, because a fire truck has armament on it. It's got huge bumpers. It can push tree stumps out of the way. So that's not the case. My concern is allowing it to move. And at the very most, this type of intersection is not going to eliminate the traffic problem, because it's not transferring what's causing the traffic problem. It's just not. A bypass would. There's more surface to allow for what's causing the impact in the first place. Now, I lived here a lot of years, and we only had this problem with this intersection start about 12 years ago. It's 10 years ago it started getting noticeable. But it seemed like there was all of a sudden one day, it started big and heavy, and I believe the schools rearranged their scheduling for buses and different things, because I don't think there was a noticeable increase in population to account for that. And if this is the case, if the schools are creating some of the morning time problems, then generally during the day I don't have any problems going through. Maybe late afternoon there's a little bit with commuters, and that's from the Highway 12 portion going from east to west. But it's the morning hours that are really terrible from 26 going north, getting through the intersection. And it's not just a school bus that causes the school problems. There's a lot of mothers transporting their kids individually with cars. And in order to eliminate some of those, maybe a bypass or something, or maybe the school, has anybody talked to the school? Maybe this isn't a problem, and I'm just dreaming up something, but this is what my observations have been in living here and watching. Because I moved out of gridlock when I moved to Calaveras County. And when I moved up here in 78, I didn't even have to stop on Highway 12. The stop sign there weren't any cars for miles in either direction. Now there is. I have to stop and sometimes wait for 5 minutes, but this intersection got kind of bad. And especially it's getting really concerning to me for public safety. So whatever we do, I hope we do it to corral the real problems that are causing it, and not just looking at an aerial view and, hey, that looks good, and let's get it, and let's get that one that's the cheapest one. Well, the cheapest one might cause you the most money by the time you get through with it, if you have to remove it. And I've heard stories about other ones installed and having to be removed. Is that true? Or you can tell me. I don't want to start rumors.
I don't know that there's ever, I'm not aware of one that's been installed and removed. I would certainly say that even in the communities where they've been installed, there's still people that love them and people that don't.